Hamas can stay down in these tunnels for quite a long time,
Mm.
waging war from underground. And I think that's something that the Israelis are really looking at as a quite frightening prospect. So, and they don't really have any grand plan for dealing with the tunnels. I mean, you've heard stories about how they're going to flood them and so on. I mean, I'm told that that's, the flooding idea is something that will happen at the end of the war, after Hamas and the tunnels are empty. They'll use those pumps they've got in to flood the tunnels with seawater to try and put them out of action on a permanent basis, or at least they're considering the technology that would be required to do that. But in the meantime, they just have to, I mean, it's literally a sort of, step-by-step process of going through, the ruins of apartment blocks and streets, looking for holes in the ground and sticking, landmines down them to blow them up. It's
I suppose I want to start by considering what would a ceasefire vote have meant for the war. If this had passed, this resolution, what would have been the real life impact?
I don't think Israel would have taken any notice of it, but
Yeah.
it would have, the important thing there would actually have been less the veto, but less the resolution, but the fact that America had, excuse me, had abandoned its support for Israel in this war. I mean, Israel depends entirely on America for, not entirely on America, it depends very strongly on America for both military support and moral support in its in this war, and indeed in its positioning in the world generally and its relationship with the Middle East. So I think any suggestion that America was not behind them would have been devastating for Israel at a psychological level. It would be very hard for America to vote for a ceasefire, see Israel take no notice of that, and continue to provide arms and so on to Israel. So I think that would have been the significant thing. Really, a UN resolution has great weight. They are indeed often ignored, it has to be said.
Indeed. And so that's interesting then, because if it's about the kind of US-Israel relationship, the US representative had argued that Hamas has no desire to see any sense of durable peace, and a ceasefire would only plant the seeds of the next war. So that message has been quite consistent since the start when it comes to conversations about ceasefire. I just wonder if the strategy here from the UN is about trying to build towards that tipping point where eventually there will be calls for a ceasefire, and frankly, the message might change from the US to Israel to say enough is enough.
I think it works in a slightly more what's the word, piecemeal and gradual way than that. I mean, what is the case is that the Biden administration is under a huge amount of pressure, both from other countries, from its Middle East allies, its Arab allies in the Middle East, I should say, and from many Democrats, many particularly younger Democrats, are not fully behind America in its position on Israel, which is a new and developing thing in America. That change of sentiment, which you're seeing very strongly in protests in America, which was usually very distinct from Europe on this issue. So all these things play into Biden's positioning, and Biden's positioning is subtle and is shifting. And we saw this week the Biden administration say very strongly to Israel, "You have a month more to do this war, and then you have to stop." So these things all play together in a sort of subtle, in a sort of geopolitical dance, and that's what it's leading towards, which is Israel trying to finish the ground war in by early January. Their estimate is it would probably take until the end of January. America would like to see it stop sooner than that, but that's how it's all kind of playing out, I think.
Yeah. The US involvement as well has been reported over the last few days is kind of alongside, in some ways, or working with the Palestinian Authority on a plan to run Gaza once the war is over. And this has kind of been refreshed once again by the Palestinian Prime Minister, who's been saying that is how this is working, that US officials and the Palestinian Authority are working together. What can you tell us about that, Richard? And I suppose the reception that those sorts of conversations are getting now and may get once the ground offensive is over.
Yeah, this is a massive jigsaw. What happens in Gaza, because different, whereas a jigsaw where the pieces are set, but the picture looks differently. There are all these different pieces. There is the Palestinian Authority. There is the people on the ground in Gaza. They can't be ignored, of course. The 2.3 million people there. America, excuse me.
That's all right. Take your time.
Tickle in my throat today.
That's okay.
The Israelis say no to the Palestinian Authority, or perhaps I should say Netanyahu says no to the Palestinian Authority. He's viscerally hostile to the Palestinian Authority. He before this worked with Hamas more closely in some ways than he did the Palestinian Authority. But then there are different aspects of the Palestinian Authority: the actual administration, the civil servants, if you like. I think that's what people are looking at. The leadership is a different matter. The Israeli electoral government establishment, the main parties, once the Mahmoud Abbas, who's the president of the Palestinian Authority, quit, be forced out. He's been there getting on for 20 years, since the death of Yasser Arafat. And he has been, somewhat ineffectual in their view. And he's also, he is prone to these extraordinary anti-Israel outbursts. They want a complete change of policy on the way the Palestinian Authority, a change of path on the way the Palestinian Authority behaves in public. Israel sees it as geeing up anti-Israel and indeed anti-Semitic feeling in the West Bank, while Israel supervises the delivery of services. I mean, that's not how the Palestinians see it. They see Abbas as being weak and ineffectual in preventing settlement building in the West Bank. Nobody likes him very much. So I think the hope of the Americans is that there'll be a new Palestinian leader, there'll be a new kind of arrangement in the Palestinian political scene. I think they suspect that Netanyahu himself will also leave, so there'll be a more flexible prime minister, they hope, in Israel, and that something can be put together. Israel has different views on what's going to happen afterwards, which it doesn't really articulate, but it probably involves a security relationship between itself and one or two friendly Arab states like the United Arab Emirates, and then allowing the UN to rebuild Gaza. Israel doesn't really want much more to do with Gaza other than maintaining security control, and that's again another area where there's going to be disagreement about how Israel enforces the security control in Gaza that it now insists it must have.
Just another one on how the ground offensive is playing out, Richard. And this is your latest article for The Times, is looking at this sort of quite well publicised tunnel network that Hamas runs under Gaza, and indeed the changing approaches of the Israeli military to trying to sort of counter the impact the tunnel system can have. To what extent are the Israeli Defence Forces struggling with the tunnel system and the tunnel network and fighting Hamas terrorists as a result?
Yeah, I think this is going to take an ever more prominent role. Actually, I mean, we all knew that Hamas had tunnels. I mean, that was well known. After the last major sort of war in 2014, Israel moved in to block off some of the tunnels they'd dug into Israel to use as kind of attack tunnels. And they knew they also had tunnels inside Gaza. But what they now realize is that Hamas weren't exaggerating when they said they had 300 miles of tunnels, 500 kilometers of tunnels under Gaza, which is an incredible, this is a very small area. And that's an incredible network. And it's become clear, the Israelis have managed to move into Gaza on the ground much more quickly than I think people expected. But that raises this extraordinary prospect, I mean, a unique prospect, and it sounds sort of almost cartoonish, of a war fought in the medium term between Israel on the ground in Gaza, the Israeli army on the ground, and Hamas underground. And they have stockpiles there, they have weapons, they have ammo, they even have missiles stored underground, and they have their access shafts to come out overground, so they can stay in these tunnels, which Israel really doesn't want to go into because it's obviously a very easy place to ambush and kidnap Israeli soldiers. They've got the hostages down there. So Hamas can stay down in these tunnels for quite a long time,
Mm.
waging war from underground. And I think that's something that the Israelis are really looking at as a quite frightening prospect. So, and they don't really have any grand plan for dealing with the tunnels. I mean, you've heard stories about how they're going to flood them and so on. I mean, I'm told that that's, the flooding idea is something that will happen at the end of the war, after Hamas and the tunnels are empty. They'll use those pumps they've got in to flood the tunnels with seawater to try and put them out of action on a permanent basis, or at least they're considering the technology that would be required to do that. But in the meantime, they just have to, I mean, it's literally a sort of, step-by-step process of going through, the ruins of apartment blocks and streets, looking for holes in the ground and sticking, landmines down them to blow them up. It's very unsophisticated, and it is causing casualties. The son of the former Israeli chief of staff was killed on Thursday doing exactly this, trying to deal with a tunnel shaft which exploded with a booby trap. So yeah, it's a pretty extraordinary tale that's unfolding there.
Richard, many thanks for joining us. Good to speak to you this morning. Richard Spencer, at the Times special correspondent in Israel, giving us a bit of a picture both of that UN resolution vote and veto from the US, and indeed the sort of strategic military situation on the ground.